Hello, and welcome to A Sound Constitution here on CHLY 101.7 FM. This is a show where we focus on health topics that are important to our community. This year's team is made up of 6 third-year VIU nursing students. Our goal? To demystify health issues and address common misconceptions by sharing evidence-informed information from a variety of reliable sources. All information provided on our show will be available in our show notes, on our Facebook and Instagram pages. We want to remind listeners that the information presented in this show is for educational purposes only. It does not replace the advice of your primary healthcare professional. If you have any questions or concerns about what's being discussed, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook at A Sound Constitution, on Instagram at CHLY, A Sound Constitution, all one word, or email us at asoundconstitution@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in, and we're looking forward to this journey with you.
We begin today by acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded and traditional lands of the Sinaimo people, whose rich cultural history continues to inspire and guide us. Our broadcast also extends into the territories of the Coatsan and the Sliaman nations. We are deeply thankful for the Sinaimo people's enduring connection to this land and for the opportunity to live, learn, and work here today. We make this acknowledgement with a commitment to honor and respect Indigenous cultures, traditions, and histories, and to actively participate in the ongoing work of truth and reconciliation. For more information on the ongoing reconciliation work and land acknowledgement practices of the Sinaimo people, we invite you to visit our Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube pages.
Welcome back to A Sound Constitution. I'm Anna, and I'm joined by Madison and Rebecca for this hour, and we're talking about a term called ableism. Not as a buzzword, not as being nice, but something you can trace in data, law, healthcare systems, policy, and everyday design. Before we start, it's worth naming the reaction many may have, maybe even you. Oh great, another ism. We're expected to care about another social issue, another set of language rules, another thing to get right. And that reaction makes sense. If no one taught you what ableism is or how it's wired into policy and design, it's easy to dismiss it as just political correctness or a niche concern that only affects a small group of people. So let's start with what research makes undeniable. Disability is not rare, and it's not someone else's issue. Roughly 1 in 5 people currently live with disability in Canada, depending on the source. And if people live long enough, most will experience disability through aging, injury, illness, sensory change, or chronic conditions. Disability is not a fixed category, it's a common human state across the lifespan. Which means ableism is not about us versus them, it's about how systems are built, who gets full participation by default. Today's episode focuses on ableism as it's documented in research, not as a matter of opinion, inspiration, or personal interpretation. This hour will draw from disability studies, Canadian human rights reports, peer-reviewed healthcare data, accessibility law, and work published by disabled scholars, journalists, and activists. The goal is not to speak for anybody, but to make the evidence visible. Ableism in the literature is not defined as unkindness or individual prejudice. It's defined as a structural pattern of barriers, expectations, and policies that exclude people with disabilities, whether intentionally or not. And that pattern is measurable in multiple systems, including right here on Central Vancouver Island. We see barriers in healthcare, most often in diagnostics and transportation to care. We'll see higher disability rates among older adults in Nanaimo and Oceanside, and the infrastructure hasn't kept up. We see employment studies showing disabled workers are hired less and kept on less than their non-disabled peers. We see students who qualify for accommodations but don't ask because the process demands disclosure and proof. And we see provincial reports naming the same top 4 barriers again and again and again. Transportation, the built environment, digital access, and healthcare navigation. None of this depends on opinion. It's all there in policy analysis, census data, and disability research. So this hour is not about pity or inspiration, it's about evidence. Here's where we're going. First, a clear definition of ableism from law, research, and disability justice. Then, the 3 levels: interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. A bias exercise sprinkled in here and there. A TED Talk from Alison Seal, who's dismantling the idea of normal. A deep dive into how language, policy, and design either include or exclude. And finally, structural entry points where change can actually happen. The focus is not on personal attitudes. The focus is on evidence that shows how systems are built and who these systems consistently leave out. So with that, here's the definition that scholars, human rights bodies, and disability justice rights agree on. Take it away, Rebecca.
Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca, and thank you, Anna, for introducing the episode. It's great to be here with you. Today, I'm going to be diving into a topic that often goes unexamined but shapes so much of daily life: ableism. Let's ground this conversation with precision. Ableism is bias, discrimination, or prejudice against people with disabilities, and it doesn't just live in someone's bad attitude. It also lives in the rules and blueprints we treat as normal. The Ontario Human Rights Commission of 2023 puts it plainly. Ableism can be conscious or unconscious, and it can be embedded in institutions, systems, or the broader culture, limiting people's opportunities and inclusion. Pause with me here on a few honest questions. When you hear normal, whose body and mind are you picturing? When a syllabus or work shift assumes everyone can sit, read, focus, and move in the same way, what story about real students or ideal employees is being told? Those defaults are not neutral. Even our federal definition of disability in the Accessible Canada Act frames disability as something that happens in an interaction with a barrier, not a flaw in the person. That's crucial because it shifts responsibility from the individual to the environment. Now, let's connect ideas. Many of us were taught a medical model of disability where the problem is inside the person, so the solution is in the body or mind. Disability scholars and activists push back with what's called the social model of disability. The idea that people are disabled by environments, policies, and attitudes that refuse to flex. Sociologist Mike Oliver was central to the shift. He argued that the real leverage is in changing society's design, not correcting the person. Ask yourself, if a door is too narrow for a mobility device, who needs fixing, the person or the door? Scale matters too. The World Health Organization 2021 estimates that about 15% of the world's population lives with some form of disability, over 1 billion people, and that prevalence is rising as populations age and chronic conditions increase. If that's the scale, special arrangements will never keep up. Only universal design and barrier removal will. For a sharp and funny take on this, check out Stella Young's 2014 TED Talk, "I'm Not Your Inspiration. Thank you very much." It's a classic for a reason. As we keep going through this episode, bring real places to your mind: your workplace, your gym, your classroom, your clinic. Ask yourself, what are the defaults here? Who slips through the cracks those defaults create? And if your first instinct is, well, make an exception if someone asks, ask the harder question: why wasn't it built in? You're listening to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM. We will keep layering tools so you can spot ableism and change it where you are.
Before we go any further, I want to offer a simple framework because ableism isn't one single behavior or mindset. It operates on 3 interconnected levels, a framework used by people like disability scholar Mike Oliver, policy bodies such as the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and organizations like the World Health Organization. Those 3 levels are interpersonal, institutional, and internalized. Interpersonal ableism is the one-to-one level, the comments, assumptions, or uninvited help that people think are harmless. Disability researchers call these microaggressions. And note that they are often well-intended but rooted in an ableist belief system. Examples repeatedly documented in education and workplace studies include comments such as, "You're so inspiring just for being here." Or maybe speaking to an adult with a disability, any kind of disability in a childlike tone. Offering help without consent based on only assumption, saying things like, "You don't look disabled," or assuming someone can't before they're even asked. Reflect with me for 1 second. Has anyone ever decided something for you instead of with you? That's the DNA of interpersonal ableism. The second part of this framework is institutional ableism. This is the level we're taught not to see because it hides in what feels normal. This ableism is in policy, design, architecture, legal structures, hiring systems, housing codes, curriculum rules, transit planning, medical protocols, and so much more that our society is built on. Institutional ableism is when, for example, a college lab forbids adaptive devices for safety without ever consulting any research. Or maybe a workplace policy defines quote-unquote full productivity as speed rather than quality. Transit infrastructure treats elevators as optional upgrades instead of baseline required access. Or course participation is defined only as speaking and reading and not multiple forms of contribution. This is what Mike Oliver, credited with naming the social model of disability, meant when he said, "People are disabled by barriers, not by their body." The World Health Organization backs this up. Over 1 billion people globally experience disability, yet most exclusion is created not by the impairment itself, but by environmental and attitudinal barriers. So the real institutional question is, if we only add accommodations when someone asks, is that inclusion or is that proof that they were never planned for in the first place? And the third part of this framework is internalized ableism. This is a quiet level and often very damaging. Internalized ableism is what happens when an individual has experienced interpersonal and institutional ableism long enough that the outside message has become an internal belief. It can sound internally like, "I don't want to ask for access again. I keep getting shut down. Maybe I am too slow, too much, too different. Or I'll just opt out. They probably don't want someone like me in this organization anyway." Disability scholars call this internalized oppression, and researchers note it can reduce self-advocacy, limit education and career choices, and increase mental health stress. Not because of the disability itself, but because structural exclusion becomes self-policing. So here's a reflection question for this level. How many people never even apply, speak, enter, or try because the world has already told them, the way that it's built, that there is no place here for them? To recap, interpersonal ableism shows up in what we say and assume. Institutionalized ableism shows up in what we build and require. Internalized ableism shows up in what people believe about themselves after experiencing interpersonal ableism and institutional ableism, and the layers intertwining. If we correct only interpersonal language but leave policies, architecture, timing, and expectations untouched, nothing really changes. If we make the building accessible but still treat people with disabilities as inspirational exceptions, nothing really changes. Ableism is not an attitude, it's a structure of expectations, and all three levels sustain it unless we name them out loud and build systems that ensure that these levels don't exist.
If this is new to you, breathe. This isn't about guilt, it's about literacy, seeing the hidden rules. Our invitation is simple. Stay curious. If you feel defensive, that's a signal that something important is nearby. You're listening to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM. Before we go any further, let's talk about language. Because the way we name disability shapes the way we think about disability, and whether we think the problem is in the person or in the world around them. So here's the quick version. Person-first language sounds like people with disabilities. Identity-first language sounds like disabled people. Both are valid, both have histories, and both are connected to different political, cultural, and philosophical ideas about what disability is. Person-first language gained traction in the 1980s and 90s, especially in healthcare, social work, government policy, and disability rights organizations in North America. It was created to push back against dehumanizing labels like the disabled, the handicapped, or a paraplegic. The idea was name the person first, the disability second, so the disability does not swallow the identity of the human being. That's why you'll hear phrases like a person who uses a wheelchair, a child with autism, a person living with chronic pain. Groups like the American Psychological Association and many branches of the Canadian healthcare system still use person first as the default. It's also the style used in much rehabilitation and education literature. So yes, it has a purpose. But then something powerful happened. Disabled activists, especially in the disability justice movement, the deaf community, the autistic self-advocacy movement, and writers like Stella Young, Alice Wong, Lydia X, Z. Brown, and Sins Invalid said, "My disability is not an accessory. It's not detachable. It's not shameful. It's part of who I am." Identity First language frames disability as a social and political identity, not a medical defect. Instead of centering the person in spite of disability, it says, "I am disabled by society's barriers, not by my body." This aligns with the social model of disability named by Mike Oliver, which shifts the target of change from the person to the environment. So activists say things like, disabled people deserve housing, not pity. Autistic people need acceptance, not cures. Deaf people are a linguistic and cultural community, not a broken version of hearing. This language is not about brokenness. It's about pride, culture, and resistance. So which one is correct? Here's the truth. None of us get to decide that for other people. Some people need person-first language because it reflects how they see themselves. Some people reject person-first language because it defensively separates them from their disability. Some use different language depending on context: medical, cultural, community, legal, or activist. A respectful rule of thumb used by disability scholars is ask, don't assume, use the language someone uses for themselves. Whether you say people with disabilities or disabled people, the goal is the same: dignity, accuracy, agency, and consent. Language doesn't fix ableism by itself, but it absolutely reveals where we learn to place the burden.
Thanks, Madison. So before we go deeper, let's walk through a few key terms that are important to understanding the concept of ableism. Think of this as your mental toolkit. The more precise the language, the clearer the patterns become. We just heard how ableism can live in attitudes and systems. Now let's zoom out and talk about the frameworks underneath that. The medical model says disability is inside the person, something to diagnose, treat, fix, or compensate for. The social model, first named by disability scholar Mike Oliver, flips that completely and says disability happens when a society is built for only one kind of body and mind. The problem isn't the person, the problem is the structure. And this isn't fringe thinking. The World Health Organization and Accessible Canada Act and many disability justice organizations define disability as barrier-based conditions, not a defect in the person. So here's a question to hold. When you see an exclusion, do you reflectively ask what's wrong with that person? Or what barrier made this impossible? Keep that question close. So another term is the acronym IDD, which stands for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, a term that's used in research, disability justice, and policy to describe disabilities that affect intellectual functioning, adaptive skills, and learning across the lifespan. IDD is not a single diagnosis. It can include an umbrella of conditions such as Down syndrome or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, autism, Fragile X, and so many more. Scholars like Tamar Heller and Robert Putnam point out that people with IDD often face double exclusion, excluded from disability spaces built around physical access only and excluded from policy and public life because systems assume they cannot self-advocate. For that reason, disability justice organizers insist that adults with IDD vote, work, parent, organize, and lead self-advocacy movements worldwide. One key research point, according to the U.S. National Council on Disability and Community Living, most barriers for people with IDD are not medical, they're structural. Literacy-dependent forms, time-limited appointments, guardianship laws that remove legal personhood, eligibility criteria built around IQ scores, public meetings without plain language versions or visual supports, transit systems that assume independent navigation without support workers, many, many more. So when IDD is missing from disability conversations, the issue isn't vocabulary, it's power. The disability rights slogan, "Nothing about us without us," applies here, including people who communicate differently, need support workers, or use alternative decision-making models. When IDD is left out, the picture is incomplete, and the policy that follows is incomplete too. Another key word is the term TABS, temporarily able-bodied. It's a reminder that disability is not a niche experience, it's a human one. The speaker in the TED Talk will go more into this key term. WHO data shows that over 1 billion people currently live with disabilities, and if we live long enough, disability becomes a when, not an if, through mechanisms like aging, injury, illness, neurodivergence, sensory changes, or simply time. So the real question is, are we building a world for bodies and minds we have now, or the ones we might eventually have? And this idea connects directly to what's coming next, because the way we design systems tells exactly who we think this world belongs to. So here's a distinction that clears up some confusion. Accessibility means built-in, predictable, automatic, no one has to ask, versus the word accommodation, which is something that's added later. It's conditional. It requires disclosure. One is a right, one is a repair. Accessibility says, we expected you. Accommodation says, we didn't, but we can adjust if you explain yourself. A quick test for your listening. Does the environment you're part of treat access as default or as permission? And that's the perfect bridge to the next segment, because what starts as language becomes policy, and then what becomes policy shapes everything from hiring to healthcare.
Hi, it's Rebecca. Let's do a quick mental experiment together. Don't overthink, just notice what shows up in your mind. Picture the first person who comes to mind when I say a scientist, a nurse, a CEO, a professional athlete, a parent at a playground, a university professor, a teenager studying for finals, a person giving a wedding toast. Now pause. Did any of those people have disabilities? No judgment, just data. If the answer is no, that's not a personal flaw, that's patterned exposure. Neuroscience research from Harvard's Project Implicit, the Kirwan Institute, and countless media studies show that our brains build automatic mental templates. In theory, bias isn't a belief problem. It's a pattern recognition problem. So here's what we know from the evidence. People with disabilities make up 15 to 25% of the population. Depending on the source, the World Health Organization puts it at 1.3 billion people worldwide. But in media representation, disabled characters appear in less than 3% of roles, and 95% of those roles are played by non-disabled actors. In professional imagery, stock photos, textbooks, advertising, corporate slides, disabled people appear less than 1% of the time, unless the topic is disability. In children's books, only 3.4% of characters have disabilities, and most are written as plot devices, not full people. In leadership research, disabled people are vastly underrepresented in employer profiles, keynote speaker lineups, and academic faculty bios. And in healthcare, even though up to 40% of patients over 65 live with at least one disability, disabled providers remain rare, unseen, or dismissed as exceptions. So ask yourself, how can we imagine what we have never been offered a mental picture of? How do we include people whose existence has been framed as unusual, inspirational, or invisible? This is what researchers call implicit bias, the rapid, automatic associations that happen in 0.2 seconds, before conscious thought even shows up. We don't choose these associations, we inherit them. And here's the key point. Implicit bias is not a reflection of your values, it's a reflection of your exposure. If the world repeatedly tells you that scientists walk, CEOs stand at podiums, parents run after toddlers, nurses are able-bodied, and athletes have one standard body type, your brain starts treating absence as normal and presence as exceptional. That's the foundation of ableism. Not hatred, not cruelty, just unquestioned default settings. So the question is, am I a bad person for having bias? But the real question is, what stories, people, images, and structures have I been trained not to see? And what happens when I start seeing them? Because bias isn't just about thoughts. It shapes who gets hired, who gets mentored, who gets believed, who gets medical care, who gets policy attention, who gets assumed competent, and who has to prove it over and over again. And that's what we're going into next, from invisible mental patterns to visible social structures.
Thanks so much for that, Rebecca. So we're about to play Purposeful Steps Away from Ableism. The speaker is Allison Seal, an associate professor at the University of Fraser Valley. She teaches the Workplace Task Program for adults with disabilities, previously worked in Post-Secondary Disability Resource Center, and spent 10 years as an ASL interpreter. She's pursuing a doctorate at UBC focused on the experiences of employees with intellectual disabilities in the workplace. This talk was recorded at TEDx Chilliwack. As you listen, notice how she deconstructs the able-disabled binary and invites us to treat differences of body and mind as part of the human continuum and to take purposeful steps in our own sphere. Let's get listening.
Well, I'm going to sweep with a really broad brush here, and I'm going to assume that most of the people in this room today are like me, well-intentioned, and that if we knew that we were harming people in our community so they could not live a valued life, we would want to change that. What if I told you that there's many people in this room that do that every day, unintentionally? We call it normal and we justify it. I'm talking about ableism. Have you ever heard of ableism before? Some yes, some no. Good. Most people have never heard of ableism. And I think that's because it's so pervasive in our society. It's so embedded that it's sometimes really difficult to identify. Let me give you a definition. Ableism is the superiority of able-bodied, able-minded people over people with bodies and minds that fall outside of the definition that we consider normal. Now, when I say disabled, I'm talking about people with physical, developmental, neurological, psychiatric, sensory disabilities. Actually, not disabilities, labels. It's society that disables the people because they're living in a society that devalues disabled lives. People with disabilities are 15% of the Canadian population. That's a big chunk. I've been working in the field of disabilities for over 30 years now, and in the last few years, I've done a lot of reading and a lot of research, particularly around disabled scholars. Academics like Fiona Kamari-Campbell, Simi Linton, Tom Shakespeare, and the like. These are folks that were there, and folks and other advocates that were there in the 60s and the 70s when the disability rights movement was really getting underway. These were the people that parked their wheelchairs in front of buses in a busy downtown intersection in Denver in order to be able to fight for the right to be able to access public transportation. These are the people that left their wheelchairs at the bottom of the stairs and climbed up the U.S. Capitol in order to be able to fight for changes in policy. These are the people that fought administrations at universities in order to be able to get access to education. And these are the people that continue to fight for disabled people so that they can have the same opportunities that non-disabled people take for granted. The war cry of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. So I don't identify as a disabled person. And clearly I don't have a disabled person here with me on stage. So who am I to talk about disability? So I won't. I'm going to talk about tabs and ableism. In the disability rights community, those that are proudly disabled and fight for disabled rights, they often refer to non-disabled people as tabs, temporarily able-bodied. Chew on that for a sec. What this implies is that all of us at one point or another are likely to experience disability in our life. If not us, someone we know and someone we love. Disability is part of natural human diversity, and diversity is inevitable. So I want to talk to you today about two different levels of ableism: systemic ableism and interpersonal ableism. Regardless of the level, ableism is always political, and ableism always makes it extremely difficult for disabled people to live the lives that they are worthy of, the lives that they aspire to. Ableism is the enemy of equal access for all people. So at a systemic level, when we make decisions for a group of people, say the public, and we don't consider the disability perspective or the disability experience, we're being ableist. The best result that we can expect is limited access for disabled people. We create systems for able-bodied people, able-minded people, and then we blame disabled people for not fitting in. Based on the decision-making process that we had, we've created a binary of those that fit and those that don't, those that are worthy and those that are not. And then we start to believe it, that the people that don't fit, they aren't as worthy as the rest of us. Systemic ableism, we see it everywhere. We see it in education when we teach about social justice and the atrocities that we have inflicted on people. And yet the violence that we've committed against disabled people, it remains unacknowledged in the curriculum. We see it at an economic level in consumerism. When we go into one of those big bookstores and there are shelves and shelves and shelves of books about the civil rights movement, about the feminist movement, about the LGBTQ plus movement, and possibly a book about the disability rights movement. There is a very small place for disability pride, like there are for other marginalized areas. We also see systemic ableism in the medical arena. When we devalue lives, we take away the ability for them to make decisions. We decide what we believe is their quality of life. It's this kind of ableism that has seen a 22-year-old with epilepsy or a 50-year-old with a stroke in a senior's home. It's this kind of ableism that has seen a 40-year-old have a do not resuscitate order put on their chart without their knowledge. When we look at a medical arena, we have to know that the ableism that is there impacts everything. This has led to institutionalization. It's led to eugenics. It's led to non-consensual sterilization, and it has led to parents killing their own children because of their ableist perspective on what the quality of life means. Who gets to decide what the quality of life is? Who? And how does this impact disabled people? Well, first of all, I'm betting they don't feel very welcome. Anytime they go out, they need to make a decision about, or at least think about, am I going to be able to access that facility or that information? If not, do I have the energy to fight to be able to access it? Knowing that most of society believes that part of their identity is a tragedy and not something to be proud of. The likelihood of increased violence, limited education, limited employment, limited ability to be able to raise their income, not likely to be able to buy a home, not able to participate in the same way in society as the rest of their friends and their neighbors do. This is not about disability. This is about ableism. It's what we do. At an interpersonal level. Was that a little too heavy for you? Sorry. At an interpersonal level, when we think about discrimination against disabled people, we typically think about language first. Is that true for you? Yeah? So I'm thinking about words like crazy, stupid, spaz, retard, gimp, lame. I'm sure you can mention many, many more. If we were to use that ableist language to insult a person with a disability, absolutely, we're being insensitive, no question. When we take that same ableist language, we are being insensitive when we incorporate it into our everyday conversations. I want to share with you a little bit of my TAB journey as a non-disabled person who is well-intentioned and wants to have equal access for all people in our society so that all of us can benefit. So, as Michael said, I teach in a pre-employment program for people with disabilities. And one day, a young woman, Debbie, short blonde hair, she joined me in my office. Debbie was one of my students with a developmental disability. She plunked herself down into one of my two rather uncomfortable chairs in my office facing the windows. We got, chit-chatting like we usually do. But before we got to the topic at hand, I noticed Debbie was really staring at something. I thought she was looking out the window. Followed her gaze, and she wasn't. She was actually looking at my bookshelf. Why do you have that book? She was accusingly pointing at a yellow book called Resumes for Dummies. Do you know that series, the Dummy series? Fantastic series that tells you the basics about just about anything, right? They're all yellow. It could be, real estate for dummies, iPods for dummies, taxes for dummies. You know what I'm talking about, right? Do you think I'm a dummy? No, it's just a book. They called me dummy in school and stupid. But you know which one I hated the most? Dumby. They mixed up the word dummy with my name and they called me Dumby. Debbie continued her story, telling me about how her peers had taunted her and bullied her, how she felt shame and hurt, and that she didn't belong, and that she didn't really even think she wanted to be here anymore. As she told her story, she slumped lower into her chair. She wasn't being too sensitive about a book title. She was reliving her trauma. My insides twisted as I witnessed Debbie's story and how I had inadvertently added to her grief. How many other people had been in my office, had seen that book and didn't have the courage or the generosity or maybe just the energy to tell me? How many other people's trauma had I contributed to? So that's when I began to realize that if I could recognize ableist language and change it, I could lessen the trauma in this world. I couldn't get past it. I was so embarrassed by my initial reaction to the impact of that book for Debbie. It's just a book. Like that mattered. But I have to be gentle with myself as well. And you know what? Defensiveness is part of human nature as well. Ableism is so much a part of our culture that it seems natural, necessary, morally correct, a justifiable component of our society. Most of us are well-intentioned people that don't want to harm others, but we have inadvertently been taught how to devalue disabled lives. I want to tell you another story. We were sitting around the backyard at my place, the fire pit, friends, family, everybody having a really great time. And I was having a discussion with this fellow that was sitting next to me. For today, I'm going to call him Spencer. Spencer and I are having this great conversation. And at one point, he turns to me and he goes, "That's so retarded." And I went, "Oh my gosh, did you really just say that?" And then he started with the excuses. "Well, I didn't mean it that way. I meant it in a positive way, like an extreme. Well, I didn't direct it at a person. There's nobody here with a disability. I know someone with a disability and they say it all the time. Words change and evolve. Stigma doesn't change, so it just doesn't matter. I meant slow, as in fire retardant." He actually said that. Have you heard yourself say any of those? I know, somebody said no. I know that I certainly have. Maybe not the last one about the fire retardant, but I certainly have used some of those excuses. Discrimination against people with disabilities is not natural. It is not necessary, and it certainly is not justifiable. Well-intentioned people, we say things not meaning to discriminate, but you know what? Intention doesn't change that it still harms. If we were to identify language at an interpersonal level and change it, we could impact change, reducing ableism at a systemic level. If we change what it is that we say, our language, it impacts our beliefs. And our beliefs will signal to others what we're willing to tolerate. So I'm going to ask you to do something. If you're willing, I want you to try and recognize your own ableist language. Find an appropriate replacement and use it. What helped me, what continues to help me as I work through ableist language, is I look for a word that's connected to disability. It's being used out of context and is negative. Guess what? It's likely ableist. Most of the time, it doesn't actually even reflect what it is that I'm trying to say. I'll give you some examples. Say the word, lame. That's one that I hear a lot. I used to use it when I meant it's less than what I was expecting. It's not fair. I don't like it. I would also use OCD when I meant it was too organized or too detail-oriented, and you are taking too much time. The one I'm working on right now, crazy. Anybody else who's crazy? Yeah. You know what? I'm trying to replace it with absurd, surprising, unpredictable, unexpected. There are so many other great words that explain what I'm trying to say better than the ableist language. Not only that, it takes very little energy on my part and can make a huge difference for somebody else, for a disabled person, maybe even like Debbie. So I'm going to invite you to join me in fighting ableism. I want you to take action. I want you to choose words that will be inclusive of disabled people, words that will create space where we can all live our best lives. Thank you.
You're listening to A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM. We've just heard a TED Talk that asked us to dismantle the idea of normal and look directly at the design of our world, not the bodies moving through it. Before we keep going, I want to make space for something that research says is essential in unlearning bias: self-interruption. Not guilt, not defensiveness, just the ability to pause and notice a thought you didn't choose. So take a breath and finish the sentence in your mind. I used to assume. It might be something small, or something structural, or something personal. Whatever surfaced, that sentence is powerful, because according to implicit bias research from Harvard's Project Implicit and the Kirwan Institute, awareness is the first disruptor of automatic association. You can't change a pattern you've never named. And here's the part we don't usually say out loud. Ableism doesn't only live in cruelty, it also lives in unexamined habits, in silence, in absence, in the people we never pictured in certain roles: leaders, parents, professors, athletes, bosses, lovers, friends. The World Health Organization frames disability as a barrier-based phenomenon, meaning exclusion isn't a personal flaw, it's a designed outcome. So the question becomes, now that I've noticed this assumption, what will I redesign in my mind or in my world? Because reflection isn't the end of the work. It's the doorway into different choices. In conversation, in policy, in hiring, in curriculum, in healthcare, in who we picture when we say the word we. And that's where we're heading next.
When disability studies researchers talk about interpersonal ableism, they're not just talking about slurs or open exclusion. They're looking at everyday, smaller interactions, the comments, assumptions, or behaviors that reflect larger ideas about who is expected to belong. These are what the literature calls microaggressions. And instead of defining them abstractly, let's turn them into a reflective exercise. As you listen, notice your reactions. Here are examples documented in research across Canadian education, healthcare, and community settings. Speaking to a support worker instead of a person. Assuming someone with limited speech has limited understanding. Reacting with surprise when a disabled adult has a partner, a job, or a degree. Using high functioning or low functioning as if they are objective categories. Treating accessibility as a personal favor instead of infrastructure. Praising basic participation, like that's inspiring, without engaging as an equal. Now pause for a second and notice. Which of those felt familiar? Which felt harmless? Which felt a little bit uncomfortable? Which did you picture happening to one kind of disabled person, but not another? That last question matters, because disability is not one experience and can't be classified in a box. So instead of asking, what's the right thing to say instead, the more useful research question is, what assumptions are built into the interaction in the first place? Because interpersonal behavior doesn't appear out of nowhere. It mirrors the larger system, one that still labels some people as expected participants and others surprisingly exceptions. And one last note the literature is firm on. There is no single script for respect. There is no single way people with disabilities want to be addressed. There is no shortcut word list that solves ableism. What there is pattern recognition. Once you see the expectation underneath the interaction, you start to see the structure that produces it. Where we're going next, when inclusion is performance.
There's a term in disability studies that shows up in the work of Sharon Snyder and David Mitchell, and it's called ally theater. Not theater as a genre, theater as a pattern. Disability is welcomed as a symbol, metaphor, charity, or stage material, but not as authorship, power, or decision-making. In other words, visibility without agency. Mitchell and Snyder point out that disability is often displayed so that non-disabled people can feel progressive, empathetic, or aware, while the structural hierarchy stays fully intact. Here's some very general, broad examples of how it might show up, not hypothetically, but in documented research. One example is a Disability Awareness Week run entirely by non-disabled staff. University brochures using stock photos of wheelchair users, but refusing to fund captioning or other tools that are accessibility-driven. Theater companies casting non-disabled actors in disabled roles while calling it authentic storytelling, or research about disability with no disabled co-authors, what Jay Dolmage calls studying people while structurally excluding them. As you can see, the core pattern isn't no access, but a curated access that keeps control in non-disabled hands. A few questions for listeners. When disability shows up in your workplace or classroom or policy meeting, is it content or is it collaboration? Are disabled people speaking or being spoken about? Are they on stage or are they part of the planning committee? Who signs the checks? Who edits the final document? Who's allowed to say no? Because as scholars like Hamraie and Katari note, inclusion without co-design is just public relations. This is why disability justice organizers reject the word inclusion when it means you can enter the room, but you don't have power to redesign it. The Disability Arts Collective, called Sins Invalid, names this clearly: nothing about us without us. It's not just a slogan, but a boundary. It marks the difference between representation and extraction. Not tell our story, not feature our bravery, but share the power or stop calling it inclusion. The reflective question isn't, do I support disability rights? It's, where is disability located in the structures I'm part of? Is it at the center, at the margins, or is it in the marketing? And this is where conversations shift from performance to practice, because researchers don't just document what goes wrong, they also identify where structural change actually happens.
What follows is not a checklist, not a how-to, and not 5 easy steps. These are 5 places where researchers, activists, and self-advocates repeatedly observe structural ableism being built and sometimes dismantled. Not all disability is visible, not all disability is physical, and research that ignores people with intellectual, developmental, or cognitive disabilities is incomplete by definition. So these 5 points are not solutions, they are pressure points. Policy design and eligibility rules. Studies by Hamraie, Dolmage, and the Council of Canadians with Disabilities show that access is shaped long before anyone enters a building. Who counts as disabled enough, independent enough, or safe enough is decided in policy language, often without the input of people who use communication devices, need support workers, or rely on guardianship alternatives. Policy is where exclusion begins. Built and sensory environment. The World Health Organization reports that most exclusion is barrier-based, not diagnosis-based, and those barriers aren't only stairs. For people with some spectrum of autism, fluorescent lighting can be as disabling as a locked door. For someone with an intellectual disability, signage and instructions designed only for advanced literacy can shut down independence. For people who use wheelchairs or walkers, a tiny lip at a doorway can mean the difference between entry and not being able to enter. Ramps are one form of access. Plain language, quiet space, visual schedules, and flexible time are also access. There is so much more to this list if those impacted are simply included in their needs being planned for and included in the design. Next, we have decision-making power. Research from Cornell and the Disability Leadership Institute shows a consistent pattern. Systems change only when people with disabilities including people with developmental disabilities, hold real authority, not just advisory roles. Representation on a brochure does not equal representation on a hiring committee. Consultation without shared decision-making power is simply ally theater in policy form. Communication norms. Health communication research shows something uncomfortable. The quality of care people receive is more strongly predicted by how clinicians speak to them than by the medical condition they have. If someone uses AAC or needs extra processing time or has a support worker, being spoken around instead of to is not a personality problem. It's structural exclusion. Communication is not soft skill. It determines access to consent, information, and autonomy. Then we have data and visibility. UN disability inclusion reports show that entire disability communities disappear in policy because they are not counted, especially people with intellectual disabilities, people living in group homes, and people labeled unemployable by state systems. When a system doesn't ask, measure, or track disability, it can claim no problem, while the exclusion remains undocumented. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is a design choice. These 5 entry points are not fixes. They are locations of responsibility. They are places where ableism is built, and therefore the places where it can be interrupted. Not by goodwill, not by personal niceness, but by changing the structure that decides who gets in, who is heard, and who is expected. And that leads to the next question in our hour. If ableism isn't mainly about individual attitudes, then where and how do people actually interrupt it? That's where we go next.
Thanks, Madison. So finally, zooming all the way in, looking at barriers on Central Island isn't abstract. It exists in infrastructure and access and policy. Local disability advocates consistently point to 3 recurring structural gaps: transit and paratransit limits between Nanaimo, Parksville, Ladysmith, Qualicum, and rural communities, especially for adults with intellectual or developmental disabilities who rely on predictable routes, support workers, and door-to-door service. Wait lists for ACC devices, neuroassessment, supported decision-making services, and mobility aids that can stretch for months or years, sometimes even past the age limits of eligibility. Another one is built space and accessibility in older schools, medical offices, rental housing, and municipal spaces, including the lack of visual schedules, quiet rooms, plain language signage, or wheelchair-accessible washrooms. All of this is budget, zoning, planning, and policy design. I'm going to invite listeners that if they want system levers, not inspirational stories, here are some real local sites of action. There's the Nanaimo Disability Resource Center, which specializes in advocacy, peer navigation, equipment loans. Community Living BC is a provincial support system for adults with intellectual disabilities. The Island Health Patient Voices Network, where disabled residents, including those with cognitive disabilities, can register as decision-making partners. The Nanaimo Association for Community Living supports employment, housing, and day programs for those with disabilities. There's Disability Without Poverty, the BC chapter, which is a national advocacy organization for guaranteed livable income. And Self-Advocates of Nanaimo, peer-led leadership by people with intellectual disabilities, not parents or service providers. Links to all of these associations can be found in our show notes. They're not charities, they're policy levers and community governance sites. If the story doesn't lead back to policy, it isn't a disability story, it's a feel-good detour. So we open with a question, why should I care? And so here's the closing question. If disability is not rare, it's not tragic, it's not niche, and it's not temporary, what does it mean that our systems still behave as it is? Before we close, I want to leave you with the voice of someone who reshaped how the world talks about disability, the late writer, comedian, and activist Stella Young, as heard on her TED Talk. She challenged the idea that disabled people exist to inspire the rest of us and asked us instead to question the expectations we place on who belongs and what normal even means. Here she is in her own words.
I really want to live in a world where disability is not the exception but the norm. I want to live in a world where we don't have such low expectations of disabled people that we are congratulated for getting out of bed and remembering our own names in the morning. I want to live in a world where we value genuine achievement for disabled people. And I want to live in a world where a kid in year 11 in a Melbourne high school is not one bit surprised that his new teacher is a wheelchair user. Disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you think you know about it does.
That was Stella Young, and her point still stands. Disability isn't exceptional. Redesigning our assumptions is. This has been A Sound Constitution on CHLY 101.7 FM. I'm Anna. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening. For details and show notes from today's episode, or to follow along on what's coming up this season, check out our Facebook page, A Sound Constitution, or our Instagram at CHLY A Sound Constitution. If you missed today's episode, or if you'd like to listen to one of our previous episodes, check us out on Spotify or YouTube at A Sound Constitution. We want to remind our listeners that the information presented in this show is for educational purposes only and does not replace the advice of your primary healthcare professional. Thanks again, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.